There's an ongoing debate about how we should read and interpret literature. In the early 20th century, the formalists sought to understand more about a text simply by the art of the text itself, something they called literariness. And this was taken to its extreme in the mid 20th century with the structuralists and post structuralists, who believed that a text should be interpreted without any external influences on the reader, external influences meaning biography or history. But something that interests me about literature is how it connects us to the greater issues of the time period in which it was written. This may sound like a strictly historicist bias, but I think we can understand a lot about a text just by knowing where it sits within history. The poems we read today are all going to reflect a specific time in American history, the early civil rights period. And I think it'd be at the detriment of the poems if we didn't preface our readings with at least some understanding of the time period itself. The flourishing of African American arts and culture in the Harlem Renaissance served as an economic boon for some, but meanwhile, African Americans were still fighting for the right to vote and suffering in squalid housing conditions in major cities. Those returning from war often experienced the very same prejudice they knew before they left, and there remained little in the way of effective political representation. This would change with the onset of the Civil Rights era. There was a prevailing feeling among African American artists that civil rights were not only on their way, but that they'd come whether or not the ruling classes were ready for them. As one particular song says, which would become an anthem for the civil rights movement, "Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome." For African American writers in the 20th century, this sentiment was conveyed through their meditations on their place in society and the inevitable goal of being considered equals. We'll begin with a poem by Countee Cullen titled, "Yet Do I Marvel." What's interesting to me about this piece is that it's housed in a traditional verse form, the sonnet, so as to make it more approachable and recognizable, but it's bursting at its seams with an overtly political message. The speaker in Yet Do I Marvel recognizes that there are forces at work in the universe that are so far beyond his comprehension that he can only marvel at them. Speaking about the divine, the speaker says, "I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind, and did he stoop to quibble, could tell why. Or, in other words, if God decided to, he could explain why. The little buried mole continues blind, why flesh that mirrors him, in other words, us, must some day die. God could make plain the reason tortured Tantalus is baited by the fickle fruit, declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair." In the octave of this sonnet, the space where the problem, the greater question, is developed, the speaker is relating that all the curiosities, all the perceived injustices in the world, all the meanness and death, just as Frost observed with the white spider capturing the moth in Design, could be regarded as part of God's greater plan. To transition to the sestet of the sonnet, the resolution half, it's often said that God works in mysterious ways. This is usually given as a response when there's a moment of hardship that we can't explain ourselves, but still believe nonetheless that there must be some greater purpose for it. Inscrutable his ways are, the speaker says, meaning that God cannot be questioned by the human mind, which is too strewn with petty cares to be able to understand the will of the Creator. But even though the speaker does not question God, he says, "Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing." The poem is unique in that it houses a combination of Petrarchan and English sonnet verse conventions. Like a Petrarchan poem, there's a definite octave being built to the top half of the poem, where the speaker is meditating on life's curiosities, and a definite sense of movement that occurs around the ninth line, when the speaker shifts focus to the omnipotence of the divine. Yet the rhyme scheme itself is heavily influenced by the English sonnet. It has 7 rhymes and a rhyming couplet at the end. And there's a secondary shift of perspective just before this couplet, functioning like the turn or the volta from the English sonnet. "Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing." This is where the sonnet transfers all of its momentum into one final realization about life's cruel ironies, as if the speaker had been gently knocking on a window pane, but has now just smashed through it. How do you interpret these final lines? Why should the speaker marvel at this? What kind of commentary does this offer for African American artists in the early 20th century in general? In our next poem, Tenebris, civil rights are given a more visual representation by Angelina Weld Grimke, who writes, "There is a tree by day that, at night, has a shadow, a hand huge and black, with fingers long and black, all through the dark against the white man's house. In the little wind, the black hand plucks and plucks at the bricks. The bricks are the color of blood and very small. Is it a black hand, or is it a shadow?" Tenebris has an irregular shape and meter. so Grimke instead relies on the use of colors to build tension in her poem. First, what do the colors represent in this poem? Our first clue is that tenebris means darkness. We have this image of a black hand, a shadow cast by a tree, plucking at the bricks of the white man's house. The bricks are red, the color of blood. But whose blood and whose hand? The speaker tells us that by day there's only a tree there, and only at night do we see the shadow, which takes on the impression of a hand. When a little wind blows, though, this hand appears to scratch and pluck at the bricks. Well, if the image is only a shadow, then there's no real danger of the building being torn apart. But we have to ask ourselves, what does this building represent? Its bricks, after all, are stained with the color of blood, the blood of others, perhaps. And though it stands as an institution of power, as something concrete, stable, the white man's house, the bricks are very small and vulnerable. Indeed, a little wind is blowing, a little noise. What noise could that be? And piece by piece, the shadow is plucking these small bricks out. The speaker asks at the end of the poem, is it a black hand or is it a shadow? But the question is largely rhetorical. Of course, this represents something deeper than what we see on the surface. And if the shadow of a hand is cast on the building, this means that the actual hand itself must be somewhere nearby, waiting for its night to come. Indeed, Grimke seems to be telling us that the time is near for an upheaval to occur. And I think this is representative of a common theme in early 20th century civil rights poetry. Langston Hughes would appear to agree with Grimke in that it would only be a matter of time before civil rights came and for the old power structures to fade. Listen to this poem, which is another one I assigned for this week's readings. It's called I Too. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. The works of Cullen, Grimke, and Hughes all demonstrate a pivotal time in American history. Civil rights quickly became a matter of national urgency as the country could no longer ignore the discontented voices of black Americans who would soon be participating in organized sit-ins, picketing, and making themselves heard to their local delegates. Eventually, their struggle made the difference. But of the writers covered today, only Hughes would survive to see the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. Each of them, however, was just as instrumental to giving a voice to the black experience in the 20th century. One listens to the Dream speech by Dr. King and hears traces of this poem by Hughes. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth, and every man is free. You see, good poetry will exist for as long as the medium it is written on will persevere. But I think the best poetry is the kind that shares a cultural experience with the people who read it. Countee Cullen, Angelina Weld Grimke, and Langston Hughes have all long passed, but through their poetry we can still learn much about the world they lived in. This is going to conclude our lecture for today.